Well, welcome everyone to my lecture that the Menger Institute has asked me to give on anarchy and my specific areas of research and lecturing expertise center on what we might call private law and private defense. And so I'll be summarizing some of my thoughts on that for this self-contained lecture. Also, let me just mention, I have given similar talks at Mises University, but in this particular version, I am going to try to bring in some other elements that I don't often discuss when giving these remarks. So before diving into it, maybe just let's take a step back and discuss what is the underlying framework here, right? So one way to motivate it that I can use, particularly with an American audience, because I know that they would have been exposed to this line of thinking, is to say, hey, it's pretty standard that especially people who are familiar with what's called free market economics, or maybe libertarianism might be the term that they apply to it, where people will say, hey, there's a lot of services right now that are provided by the government at various levels, but we can imagine a society where those services are provided by the market. And so one obvious example would be the schools, that in the United States, there's a mixture where some schools are completely run in the private sector. There's actually what's called homeschooling, where parents can just keep their kids at home and teach them directly that way. And then there's also what's called public schools or government-run schools. And so because you do have that side-by-side framework, it's not too radical to suppose that you can imagine a world where the government just completely gets out of schooling altogether. And maybe, depending on the person's views, they might say, oh, but what about poor kids that, their parents can't afford to pay private school tuition? And so you might say, okay, well, there could be a role for the state to give, philanthropic support in such cases. So personally, and as would make sense given your focus in this particular pillar of the series on philanthropy, I don't think coercion is necessary even on that element in terms of funding. But putting that aside, I'm just saying that in the standard U.S. discourse, at least, that's one way that people can approach this, and sort of taking what you might call baby steps to say you can imagine that, hey, just because you're concerned about everybody learning how to read and write and things like that, that doesn't mean that the state needs to actually run the buildings and go and hire the teachers and pay for the school buses to bring the kids there, and certainly to pass laws requiring that kids between a certain age range go to school for whatever it is, 9 hours a day. That you can imagine a more voluntary framework. And then, yes, if you're concerned about poor parents not being able to afford the tuition, you could provide subsidies, right? That there's the government spends a lot of money providing poor households with financial assistance so they can go buy food. But you don't have a massive network that in every town there's a big building that is the government, food distribution center where families can send their, or they can go to and just get free, ostensibly free food for their home. And that, the big government food distribution center hires thousands of employees. And that's actually a big part of, the workforce, as all the people that are directly employed by the government to make sure everybody gets food, right? You don't do that. That's not the model that's used. Okay. So there's that sort of element to get people warmed up to the idea. And so you say, okay, yeah, I could see how completely private sector run education could work. And that doesn't seem too radical. And then you could take another step and say, all right, well, what about the roads? Like that's a function that a lot of people immediately think that's something clearly that the government has to do. And you can just push back on that notion and say, well, why? It's not that there's some secret skill involved and that only government employees understand how to use concrete and to have the paint that puts the lines on the road properly and to understand how intersections work and things like that, right? So, and then also there are plenty of large plots of land that are privately owned where they have a road network, like Disney World and things like that. They certainly have a lot of traffic that goes to and fro with various types of vehicles and a lot of people walking on their property, and they don't need the government to come in and to, build the roads or the sidewalks and to maintain all that. That's all done internally, right? So even though for a lot of people there might be a conceptual hurdle about, well, who determines what the rules of the road are and things like that, and what happens when one owner's road network has to sync up with another one. But even there, I can say, okay, well, how do humans deal with the fact that at the borders of a country, there's clearly one government on one side of the border and a different government on the other side? And so does that mean it's impossible for trucks to pass from one country to the other because we don't have a higher level government that's in charge of everything? And obviously, no. It's when you have adjacent jurisdictions controlled by their respective governments, they figure out a way to make sure their roads sync up with each other, because that's obvious, right? So likewise, if all of the real estate is privately owned and all the roads are privately built and maintained and so forth, there's no reason that the various respective private owners couldn't come up with an efficient way to coordinate with each other, because that would just be good for business, okay? In fact, you would expect them to coordinate better than governments, because the business owners would be the ones directly profiting from having, more efficient flow of goods and so forth, whereas government officials who are in charge of a highway program, they can't directly, if they figure out how to build the highways with 10% lower cost, it's not that they get to pocket the money as shareholders. No, that would be considered as embezzlement of public funds. They would go to jail if they got caught doing it. So instead, what they'll do is they'll give lush contracts to their buddies, and the roads will be built at far higher cost than is necessary, because that, and then when the officials in charge of approving that expenditure then leave government, they might get some nice cushy consulting job or something like that. It's called the revolving door of politics and big business. Okay. So even there, you can imagine. So one way to motivate when I talk about private law and private defense is just say, okay, you see the logic of privatization and how, yes, if there really are legitimate, very critical services that typically are provided either largely or entirely by the government or, coercive state apparatus, we can talk about, are there mechanisms in place for the same reasons that we wouldn't want the government to be in charge of making cars or growing all the food, right? Most people realize outright central planning communism doesn't work. And so for all the reasons that we don't want the government involved in all these other types of industries, why would we let the government be in charge of deciding who should go into a cage, possibly for life, or who should get electrocuted? And why should the same government officials that we would never trust with making cars or building houses or programming computers, we would never trust the politicians to do those tasks, but yet we will give them the stockpile of nuclear weapons and say, oh, and here, you can also have the intelligence agencies that have secret prisons around the globe, if I'm talking about the U.S. government and the CIA, and just, you promise us, though, that you're only really going after bad guys, because otherwise we're going to be upset, right? And maybe the next election we'll vote for somebody else of the two candidates that might plausibly win, right? So you can see that's kind of a nutty system when you describe it like that. So the question is, the same logic of privatization and relying on competition and market forces, why can't we deploy that in these realms of what you might call judicial services and police law enforcement and military defense? Okay, so what I'm going to sketch out in the remaining time I have here with you folks is how could that work? All right, and so I'll give the quick positive case for it, and then with each topic, I will briefly entertain some common objections, just so you at least understand the argument and what one might say about it. Okay, so even though for a lot of people, probably the most radical thing they could conceive of would be to privatize the military and to just rely on, pure capitalism or laissez-faire to protect the country from a foreign military invasion, even though, like I say, for a lot of people, that seems like the nuttiest, or at least the hardest thing to try to justify in terms of privatization, as we're going to see. So I'll defer that to the end of this talk. Conceptually, that's not that hard, right? I mean, there's some issues about containing rogue agencies and funding, but conceptually, the idea of, given that there's going to be a flow of funds to companies that make military hardware and that they need to be staffed up and, repel invaders, that's not conceptually that difficult of a task. The thing that I think is actually much more difficult is to explain how could you privatize what we now think of as the legislature and the police and the court system that enforce the laws. Like, that to me is a lot more difficult to understand, and to motivate the confusion or the apparent conceptual difficulty. Milton Friedman one time, who's regarded as a pretty right-wing, classical liberal / libertarian, small government kind of guy, I don't remember the exact quote, but he one time said something like, you need the government, you can't get rid of the government altogether because the government has to define and set out the rules of the game and to make sure everybody plays by the rules. But then once you set up, this fairly parsimonious set of abstract rules without picking winners and losers and just enforce that neutrally, then you go ahead and, let market competition and entrepreneurship rip and let people, decide if they want to plant apple trees or if they want to grow tobacco or if they want to make pink cars or if they want to make yellow cars and so forth. And you go ahead and competition, let the most profitable firm win. But the idea is, he thought you couldn't have competition among court systems or different police agencies that enforce different types of codes, because how would that even mean? That you wouldn't have the rule of law, right? So that's where he was coming from. So let me just challenge that and say, for one thing, push to its logical conclusion, if that's how you're thinking, and that, you can have a free market and so on, but you need some external entity that's sort of above or logically antecedent to define all the property rights, and then you can go ahead and have the market run. Well, push to its logical conclusion, I think you would have to conclude that there has to be one world government, right? Because if you instead just thought, well, no, there could be, differing jurisdictions where there's one government that's in charge of, these people right here in this landmass, and then next to them, there's a different group of people with a different government that's in charge of them and defining the property rights. Well, what ensures that the property rights are mutually consistent with each other, right? If you don't have some overarching world government that adjudicates, between the respective ones. And so now some people do bite the bullet. There are people who advocate one world government, or they might, have some sort of federated system where they say, ultimately there does have to be the United Nations. But a lot of people, especially in the United States, who are, let's call them classical liberals, they're very skeptical of international bodies that have sovereignty. And so for a lot of people, they're very big believers in, the U.S. Constitution and things like that. And so they have this somewhat narrow view of, yes, within the boundaries of the United States, you have to have a strong government to enforce the rules and whatever. But again, the point is, how is it that various countries then, interact with each other without one world government? And so once you go down that path, I think you realize it's not so obvious that you do need to have one monopoly agency in charge of setting all the rules. That you can see that, in the world, as we know it, there are hundreds of different monopolists, right? So they're not really monopolists over planet Earth. They're just monopolists over their one little sector or jurisdiction, right? And that you actually do have a multiplicity of different competing systems and differing rules and so forth. So once you see that in the real world right now, we actually don't have one agency that's just in charge of everything, then, that you can see, okay, so then maybe you don't need it also within your neighborhood, right? That it's conceivable you could have different sources of legal opinion. So ultimately, just to cut to the chase, I think the fundamental building block of a private law system is one where there is no institution that systematically violates property rights. And for me, that's what it would mean to say that you live in a free society, or at least that's one possible coherent definition. All right, so it's not that a society where there's zero crime, right? Because in any realistic society, there's going to be people that are going to murder others. There's going to be, rapes and robberies and people stealing cars and things. That's going to happen. But what sets apart what I'm calling a free society, or a voluntary society, if you will, versus one that's based on statism, is that in the free society, when there are isolated examples of non-consensual interactions among people, the community can recognize and say that was a crime, or at least that was unacceptable. All right. Whereas, and you might say, well, okay, but isn't that the default right now? Like, in most societies, don't people say that, oh yeah, rape is bad and robbing banks is bad? And so, right. Yes, but they make large exceptions for the operations or activities of the state. So right now, just taxation, no private business can raise revenue the way that the government does via taxation. It would be considered theft. Right? They can dress it up and say, well, in a sense, people vote for it, and so ultimately it's consensual. They do go through procedures to try to placate the public and to get them to, quote, voluntarily send in their tax revenue. But like I say, that's private companies can't say, hey, we held a poll and 51% of the people in this region decided they wanted to use this cell phone service, so now everyone has to. And the amount that you have to pay every month for this cell phone service we're going to provide, we're going to tell you what it is. And if you don't like it, 2 years from now, you can have another popularity contest. But again, if at least 51% of you vote to keep our plan in place rather than, the plan that some other cell phone company offers, then everybody has to keep giving us the money that we'll tell you what the number's going to be. And we can just change it periodically on a whim, and the most you can do is every 2 years we'll have this procedure again where you're going to cast votes between us and one other rival company that they'll give you a different type of plan, right? They might have different features, different services, and they might charge more or less, but it's not like you're signing a contract with us. We can charge more and give fewer services than we told you we would when we were trying to get you to vote for us. That's the way it's going to work, right? So that kind of framework, you can see how that, the fact that they every 2 years have this procedure where the public gets to vote, that's maybe better than nothing, but that's a far cry from a free market and cell phone service where each individual has to voluntarily agree. And if the company says, here's the deal, we're going to give you this many minutes of long distance, we're going to give you this, download limits, gigabytes per month and blah, blah, blah. And then we're going to charge you $28 a month. And then if you sign up for that and then they start hitting your checking account and pulling out $50 a month, ultimately you could sue them, but you could certainly cancel and say, well, no, you're lying. You told me how much you're allowed to do that. And it's not that it matters what anybody else thinks. It's you personally are completely sovereign over that. Okay, so that's what I'm saying is the vision here, the type of society based on that, where you can't just raise money through what's called taxation. And this group cannot just say, we are in charge of determining who the criminals are in this region, and that no other group that tries to, like if there's some other group that starts acquiring weaponry and they're going around saying, we're going to be on the lookout and make sure that nobody breaks into banks and steal stuff from them. That's what our job is. It's like a neighborhood watch that, no, the government reserves the right to tell them, no, you can't do that. That's our job. And if we catch you doing that, we'll punish you, because we are, we can delegate our authority in certain cases. And if someone wants to use a gun to defend his home from a person who breaks in, We may investigate after the fact and say, yep, that was acceptable, but ultimately we're the ones in charge. We determine who gets to rightfully use violence in this jurisdiction. Okay, and so I'm saying no entity has that authority in an anarchist system. So that's what I'm trying to explain, like, where would the order come from then? Would it just be a bunch of roving gangs, which is what, the stereotype is. Okay, so the fundamental building block in my mind of a society like that are private judges who advertise their services and say when there is a dispute in the community, if the parties involved can't work it out themselves and come to an amicable resolution that all the parties agree is better than to continue the disagreement, you can come to me as a judge who has expertise in prior disagreements of the nature that you folks are having, right? So if it's an employer and an employee arguing about, hey, you said you were going to pay me a bonus last summer and you didn't, why not? I think you owe me this much money. And the employer says, no, because you were supposed to do this, this, and this with your job and you didn't, so that's why we didn't pay you the bonus. There's going to be judges that specialize in that type of disagreement. And somebody else is going to say, yeah, I was at home at night and somebody broke into my house and stole my television set. And when I went out to investigate, they punched me in the face. And so I want, that person to pay me compensation. Well, a different type of judge who specializes in those types of situations would advertise to render an opinion in those types of cases, right? If people are getting divorced, that would be a different type of judge who has expertise in divorces. Okay, so the fundamental thing is that this wouldn't be coercive. The judges would advertise and need both parties to submit their case to that judge's ruling, okay? Or more specifically, to render an opinion. And notice, I'm not using soft language here because of, this is an anarchist system. Even right now in our statist system, that's what do we call it when the judge renders, writes up the view? It's calling the opinion, right? You could say it's the majority opinion or the dissent. But even in our system, the way we describe it is we say that technically what's happening, it's not that the judge is making the law. The way we conceive of it, and this, it goes back to the common law days, is the law exists independent of the judiciary. And that all the judge is doing is we hope, is an expert in fairly and objectively applying the body of law, and specifically the precedents that have accumulated over time on this type of issue to the specific facts of the case at hand. And that's what the judge does, to say, yes, here's what the law is. I've heard from these two parties to this dispute. The law is relevant here, and now I'm going to come in and render an opinion as to how should the law be applied to this particular dispute. Okay, and so you might wonder, well, why would the parties agree to that? Wouldn't one of, especially if it's a case of, if it's not just an honest disagreement, because a lot of things in human conflict, both parties genuinely believe that they're in the right. And a lot of times what happens is people can be very self-serving, right? And that you see things from your point of view and you're not getting in the mind of the other person and understanding how, I did these things and that's a legitimate grievance they might have. And you're more focused on, well, they did this to me and they did this to me and that's what I'm owed, right? So to the extent that you really do have people who have honest but perhaps self-serving disagreements, they're more than happy to submit their case to some disinterested third party, so long as that person has a reputation for genuine integrity and expertise in these sorts of situations, right? Because the person who thinks he's in the right is like, no, I did what the contract said and my employer should have paid me this bonus and they didn't. And I'm happy to go to some third party judge and show the evidence of what I did, show the contract that we all signed and say, right, don't you agree? They owe me this money. Okay, so that's why a lot of the disputes people would be willing to go ahead and defer. Because the other thing too is, in most of the cases, having a deadlock where people can't resolve their dispute, that's lamentable, right? It's regrettable. People don't like to have disputes. They want to just resolve things and move on with their lives. Okay, so that's one element involved. But then even for more difficult cases, right? Like there's somebody is accused of having stolen someone's car. And so let's say that the person really did do it. So even there, and also suppose the owner of the car is absolutely sure, like he can see his vehicle, is in this guy's backyard, or he's got a garage in the backyard. He's got it in there, and the person sees it, and maybe there was some very idiosyncratic thing on the car, so that the owner knows, no, that's my vehicle. Like my vehicle went missing last week. I saw it in this guy's garage in his backyard, and that is my vehicle. It's not just that it looks like mine. That's clearly mine because of this telltale sign, right? So morally, it might be fine for that guy in the middle of the night to just sneak into that guy's backyard, break the window of the door, and reach his hand in and unlock the door and go in, start the car and drive away. He could morally be fine doing that in some objective sense, because hey, that guy stole my car, or someone else stole it and sold it to this guy. But in any event, that is my car that disappeared from my property last week, and now it's sitting in this guy's backyard. I am perfectly entitled to go retrieve my car. But the problem with him just doing that on his own is, what happens if the neighbors of that guy see some guy they don't know in the backyard breaking the glass and getting in and driving? It will look like he's a car thief. For one thing, he might get shot. Okay, but even beyond that, then it's just going to be a matter of, the community could say, hey, we saw you driving with this guy's a car thief. And he's going to say, well, no, see, and so you can see there are a lot of issues in life where this sort of thing happens, where you want to defer your restitution or your activity to reclaim property or so forth, or to make yourself whole after someone has injured you or damaged your property, that you don't want to engage in what we might call vigilantism, not merely because, it might get out of hand and you might do something that's not proportional, or like so the guy stole your car and you go back there, and then the guy's kid is in the backyard playing basketball, and he says, hey, what are you doing? Why are you stealing the car out of my dad's? And then you punch the kid, or so, there's various things where having untrained people just going and trying to exact justice could spiral out of control. And there's other types of reasons you'd want to contain that. But even putting that aside, even if someone really does act scrupulously and doesn't cause any unnecessary damage and just does the bare minimum to retrieve his property, even there's a lot of work involved to convince the community that you really are in the right, or otherwise you might get a bad reputation. Okay. And so that's part of the rationale for having judges in the first place, is to reassure the community that justice is being served, and that, because the community can't personally look at the evidence of every single case. That would just take too much time, right? People, they're dentists and they're drilling for petroleum, and they're fishermen and so forth, right? They got to go make cars in the factory. They can't put everything on hold every time someone says, hey, this guy stole my car, and I just want to show everybody the evidence. This is the deed, right? This is my car. I have the title. Here are the payments I made for it. Here's photos of me driving it around a month ago. You can, right? Everyone agree this is my, the community can't stop everything just to keep checking out that evidence and sifting through it and say, oh, okay, yeah, so that guy probably was the criminal and you can take your car back. They can't do that, right? So they outsource that, if you will, to a small group of experts who specialize in rendering opinions as to, yep, there's this dispute. This is the party that I think is in the right. And here's my opinion as to how the law comes down in this case. Okay, so the person in this case, they think the guy stole their car. They first go to a judge and, lay out the evidence. And that's the thing too, is if they accuse the other guy of having stolen the car, you might say, well, the guy who, if he really did steal the car, wouldn't he just refuse to go to any judge? And he could, but then that's going to look really bad, right? So there's that element as well. So if one guy, if the what we call the plaintiff says, here, I'm willing to submit our case to any of these 20 judges who specialize in property theft in our city, I'll go to any one of them, and that the guy who has the vehicle in his possession says, no, those guys are all crooks, I don't trust. Well, that's going to look really bad. Okay, so ultimately, I think, community pressure and whatnot would, well, at the very least, if the guy refuses to go to any of them, then the first guy, the plaintiff, can just go to somebody reputable, present the evidence, and the judge is going to, contact the guy, the defendant, and say, hey, do you want to come and show up and offer a defense? Because this guy's alleging you stole his car. We'd like to hear from you. And if that guy just doesn't show up, then, the judge can hear it and make a ruling, and probably, the guy not showing up, there might be relevant facts that don't get brought up. But then the judge makes a ruling. Suppose the other guy really has airtight evidence that, yeah, that really is my car. And then the judge makes a ruling. Yep, we agree. He showed us the payments. He showed us a bunch of photos of him driving that vehicle. He showed me, the scratch that's on the left side of the front bumper that lines up with the vehicle that's in that guy's garage. We gave opportunity for the defendant to show up and present evidence that it is his vehicle. He declined to show up. He also, it's our understanding, declined to let the case be heard by any of my 19 colleagues in this area of the law in our city. So I am quite confident in declaring my opinion in this case is that really is his vehicle, and the law says the plaintiff is entitled to having an agency that specializes in repossession to send men to that property and to extract the vehicle. And then in order to clear his name and be square with the community and the legal system, the defendant owes damages, to the person of such and such ounces of gold, to cover his legal expenses and the fee that, his insurance company is going to pay to the repo agency and blah, blah, blah. Right. So you could, stuff like that. And then the agency that retrieves it, like, so notice it's not the same company, right? The judge is he might work for an agency or something that specializes in these services, but it's not one overarching entity that employs the judges and what we might call the police. Okay. They're distinct entities. All the judge does is render an opinion about what the law says on this matter. And then the plaintiff, now with the legal opinion in his hand, can go to the separate company who, hire a bunch of burly men who have flak jackets and things on, and they specialize in going and retrieving stolen property. But they will only do it if you give them a valid court order, or I should say opinion, right? Because again, if they just send burly men around because, somebody came and said, here, I'll give you some gold coins, go get that vehicle for me. Oh, it's mine. That's why. You're not if they don't have a court opinion backing that up, that company that employs the burly men that goes and retrieves vehicles, the community might think, are you guys just going around stealing cars and then, selling them to the highest bidder? And so they could say, no, we're completely legitimate. We're law abiding. We're retrieving stolen property. See, we only act when we have an opinion from a reputable judge saying that this is in fact stolen property. Okay. So that's the way, the basic elements of the system that I have in mind. So let me quickly deal with the notion of prison in a society like that. So I don't think the right way to approach it and to conceptualize it is to imagine, we have to come up with the framework by which it will be justified for a defense agency to send out men to grab somebody and throw them in a cage. And let's just think through using principles deduced from natural law or something. under what conditions, like what, clearly if someone's just using heroin, a libertarian is going to conclude in a just free society, armed men can't go grab you and throw you in a cage for using heroin, even if we think it's immoral or sinful. But hey, if somebody robs a bank, then prima facie that could make sense that armed men are going to go and grab you and throw you in a cage, right? So be that as it may, I think there's a much more elegant, defensible solution to this kind of problem. And it runs like this. In a genuinely free society, every piece of property, the real estate, the land, is privately owned, right? So some parcels might be owned by like a company or a corporation, and so it might be a group of individuals who, in some sense, collectively own it via an intermediate company structure. But nonetheless, every piece of land is privately owned, and in principle, every piece of land, the owners can set whatever rules they want governing who is allowed to be on the property, right? So just, like with your house, you have the right, if somebody comes to your door and says, I want to come into your house, you can say, no, I don't give you my permission to come in here. You don't have to justify that to anybody. It's not like you have to prove your reasons for excluding the person are legitimate ones. Like if, some guy who's from China comes to your door and you say, no, I don't want you in here, you don't have to prove to outsiders that, oh, it's not that I'm bigoted against Chinese people. The reason I don't want him in here is, for this reason, which is like I was trying to take a nap and it would bother me to know that there's some stranger in my house. So that you don't have to do that. No, it's your property. It's your house. You can let people in or let them out and on any whim you want. It's up to you. And so I'm saying likewise with even what we might call commercial property, I think that principle would flow through unless there were policies that were explicitly stated to the contrary, right? Like a business, in order to curry goodwill with the public, might have as one of its official policies to say, oh yes, anybody can come into as long as, you don't have a communicable disease and you're not threatening and so on. Everybody's welcome here at our business. And, that might make good business sense to have that policy. But in terms of, do you have the legal ability to tell various people you can't come on? Yeah. If you own the property, sure. Okay. So, given that then, I think what would quickly emerge in a genuinely free society is a practice whereby if there is a genuine, outlaw, right? And just think, what does that term mean? Someone who is outside of the legal framework, an outlaw, outside of the law, right? So there's a bank robber who's on the run, or there's a serial killer, and, the various aggrieved parties have presented evidence to reputable judges who have expertise in, bank robberies or serial killers. And they render the opinion that, yes, we think that this person is guilty, and it's this individual right here. I don't think that we have to come up with a justification and rationale for, can people drive out and find that guy and then go and lay hands on him, pick him up, maybe handcuff him and then drive him over to a cage and hold him there for a length of time that we will determine based on what the libertarian legal code says. Okay, that for one thing, I think you're going to get pretty arbitrary pretty quickly doing that. So you say, well, okay, how would your vision handle that? So the way it would work is this. Again, every property owner has the right to eject people. And so I think if there's a genuine outlaw, someone who's wanted for murder and is on the loose, it would be pretty standard that all the property owners would say, if there's anybody like that, maybe give the list of the judges or something, right? So it just can't be Jim Smith says, oh yeah, that guy's a killer. Like that wouldn't trigger it. But if it's reputable judges who, again, have expertise in homicide, and they're saying this guy, he's a convicted killer, it's just, he's on the loose right now, then, the alert would go out and all the property owners would be on the lookout for this guy. And technically, it's not that they would take him into custody. Rather, it's they would be telling him, get off my property. But the thing is, every property owner is saying that, right? So it's not just, oh yeah, get out of my mall. And then he say, oh, okay, so I'll go outside on the public sidewalk that, nobody owns or the community owns. And so I can just be here because this is public property. Nobody can kick me off the sidewalk. And you say, well, no, because the sidewalk is also owned privately. And so whoever the owner or owners are might have it as a policy that, yeah, if you're a convicted killer on the run, you can't be on our sidewalk. Get off. Okay. And so the point is, if just about every property owner has that policy, clearly armed men can come and escort you off the property. That's clearly within the rights of the property owner, right? So you're not being grabbed and kidnapped because you're a killer. It's you're being physically removed from the property because the owner doesn't want you on the property. Okay. And so, what I think would happen in a system like that is there would emerge oases that would be beacons for such outlaws and outcasts and say, hey, if you're convicted of a serious crime and you don't have, the financial wherewithal, for example, to pay the large fines that would, be compensation and whatever, you can come here. And we have secure facilities and, we're going to pat you down when you first show up and make sure you don't have weapons on you and things like that. And we're going to monitor, we'll give you a room where you can sleep and, we'll assess you when you come in and figure out what skills you have because we need to get paid. So we want you to still work and generate an income. It doesn't help anybody for you just to sit here and not produce. But given that you apparently, have criminal tendencies, we're going to have to design a framework to keep everybody safe. And so, once you come in here, you have to stay, or, you sign some kind of contract that if you want to leave, after you've been here for a month, you can entertain going to other institutions like ours. Okay. But we're not just going to let you walk out because we have an arrangement with the neighboring landowners that they don't want us just letting our call them inmates, just walking out and going onto their property. All right. So there could be that kind of framework. And so immediately you see it's like the different restitution centers or rehabilitation houses, or you can call them private prisons if you want, but they would be competing with each other to attract the convicted criminals because that's how they earn their money, right? Like the criminal generates an income by working and pays room and board fees to, the institution. And then also, a lot of it could go to work down the debt if that's, if the judicial ruling says you owe 18 gold ounces to these people as restitution for your crime and the person doesn't have it. And so he goes and, okay. But underlying all of this stuff that I develop more fully in my essays on private law is insurance. Okay. So with a lot of this, the analog to this would be like medical malpractice insurance or auto insurance for liability, right? So if you get into a car accident and you cause damage to somebody else, your liability component of your auto insurance pays them, right? And I think in a free society, the road owners would insist that all the motorists at least have that type of coverage, all right? As opposed to you might be risky and drive your vehicle and know that if I get into an accident, like if I just go off the road and hit a tree and my car gets wrecked, maybe you don't have insurance that covers that. And so if you wreck your own car, it's tough. But I could see the road owners insisting that, no, if you want to drive on our road, if you cause damage to someone else, you need to have insurance that covers them, right? Because that just is conducive to us having more traffic on the road, that people wouldn't want to drive on the road if they knew, oh, if somebody hits me who doesn't have insurance, then, I'm out of luck. So that's, it'd be good business practice. So anyway, once you see the logic there, I'm saying there could be contracts also pledging that if you are convicted of a crime and the judge rules or gives the opinion that you owe such and such compensation to the victim or to the victim's family if you killed somebody, you could have insurance that might pay that and make the victims whole. And then that would just alter the premiums you have to pay. Or the insurance, depending on the severity of the crime, the insurance company might say, okay, we're not vouching for you anymore. If you got convicted of killing 5 separate people with an axe, yeah, we're not going to be on the hook for that anymore. You're too high of a liability. Okay. So that's, to me, would grease the wheels in terms of when would people be allowed back into society, is if they could convince one of these either insurance companies or fraternal organizations, right? There's different ways of conceiving of how this would work, but getting some external group to vouch for you, to say, okay, we've investigated this guy, we've worked with him, we think, he understands what he did was wrong. He was a young guy at the time. He was, had a drinking problem, but he's sober now. He's found Jesus, whatever. And we think he's reformed, and, he pays us a monthly premium, but we pledge, you should feel free to hire this guy, because if he does steal from you, we will make up for it, right? So other members in the community will be more likely to interact with this person who has a criminal record if he's convinced some reputable, wealthy organization to vouch for him. Okay. So that's, to me, the interaction of, like, how would a free society contain and sort of immobilize genuinely dangerous individuals, but also give a path for their reentry back into the community. And so notice the difference between that approach and the current one on the status system. Under the status system, somebody's a killer and occasionally goes up to the parole board, and if they say, yeah, we think you're rehabilitated, you can go back in the community, and then he goes and kills somebody, the people on the parole board, it's not like they have to pay $800,000 to the family of the victims or of the victim, right? It's, maybe the worst thing that would happen is they might get fired, but they're not on the hook financially. Whereas in my approach, the organization that vouches for these people, that's a business calculation. If they're wrong, if those people then get let out of the, quote, private prison and get reintegrated back into regular society because this group has vouched for them, if that person now goes and commits more crime, that organization has to pay for it. That's literally what they're doing when they vouch for them. They're saying, we will assume the penalties, the financial penalties from future crimes this person may commit. Okay. Again, it's a business for them. Like, the person is paying premiums, just like a surgeon has to pay premiums for medical malpractice insurance. But a reputable hospital is going to insist that a brain surgeon has such coverage because, hey, if you kill somebody on the operating table and it turns out that it was due to your negligence, and the family, the family of the patient that you killed is owed $5 million, the hospital doesn't want to just have to write a check. Like, we want to have insurance in place, right? So why would the insurance company offer such a policy? Because they're getting paid premiums, and they're not going to give it to somebody who's never been to medical school, right? So you can see the way all the incentives line up, and this is a much more sensible approach to the genuine problem of antisocial individuals. Okay, I spent a lot of time on that. Now let's pivot to private defense. So here, again, I think this is pretty straightforward, believe it or not. Again, I see in this realm, at least with advanced, industrialized economies with a large financial sector, I think insurance companies would be the main conduit between the property owners and the provision of defense services. Okay, so imagine a large bustling city. There's big skyscrapers, there's banks with all sorts of money and gems and things stored in the private vaults. There's a lot of wealth concentrated in this area, and they are vulnerable targets to an invasion, right? Like, some rival state might want to send its military in to steal things, or just to conquer it and then to, claim tribute or something. And so just like the owners of a big building would have fire insurance, right? In case, hey, what if there's a fire? We'd lose a lot of our property. We need to be compensated for that. So we have fire insurance policy, and we pay a premium for that. And then the fire insurance company, if it's going to be on the hook for the fire damage to this large skyscraper, they're going to insist on certain things. They're going to say, okay, yeah, before we grant you a policy indemnifying you for up to whatever, $800 million of damage from a fire, we're going to insist that you have a sprinkler system installed properly. according to these codes. And you're going to have smoke detectors installed, and you're going to have periodic drills that, to say if there is a fire, this is how you'd evacuate the building, because we don't want to be on the hook and, 200 of your employees die in a fire. We don't want to be on the hook for that, right? So we want to make sure you have adequate drills and whatever to make sure you evacuate the people. And we're also going to have contractual arrangements with a company that will send fire trucks, right? We don't call it a fire department because there's no government that runs it. It's a private business, and they put out fires, and we have a contract with them that they're on retainer. We give them a certain amount to make sure they're always ready. And then if they ever do have to come and put out a fire, they give us an extra bill that month. Okay. So that's how that would work. And I'm saying, same token, the owner of the skyscraper would say, well, yeah, if some enemy bombers came and dropped bombs and blew up my skyscraper, that would cause a lot of damage. So I would like an insurance policy to cover me for that type of risk, right? So that wouldn't be the fire insurance company. This would be a different company, right? Different type of policy. And so given now that you could imagine hundreds of millions of dollars of premiums are flowing annually to this type of insurance company or companies for, a dense modern city, they wouldn't just sit back and say, well, I hope we don't get invaded, or they wouldn't just necessarily charge ridiculously high premiums because of the large probability of an invasion at some point. No, they would take those premiums and spend them to deter the attack, right? So they would take the premiums and use them to buy surface-to-air missiles and, to build over time an air force, and to have intelligence operatives who are gathering, information about foreign governments to see, is anybody plotting to come attack us? Like, we want to have a heads up nose. If we knew that 6 months ahead of time, that would be very useful. So it would make sense to pay for that sort of information gathering ability, right? So that's the basic framework that I see for how a free society could provide military defense without engaging in taxation, without, engaging in conscription and so on. And then specifically, it would allow for the deployment of economic calculation. Right? So if you're familiar with the work of Ludwig von Mises, he famously showed that the fundamental problem with socialism is that the central planners lack economic calculation, right? If the state owns all of the means of production, if the state owns all the farmland and the factories and can tell all the different workers where to go to work, right? You don't need to say that the state literally owns their bodies, but if the state has the authority to assign different people to different jobs, well, Mises pointed out the problem is, yeah, they can, if we stipulate all that, the central planners can come up with a plan and say, here's what we're going to produce. We have all these inputs, these resources. We have known technology of how do you transform inputs into outputs. And let's go ahead and make this many diapers and this many cars and this many houses and so on next year. And they can do that. But Mises' point was, even ex post, they don't know, did we make an efficient use of society's resources? Because we don't know what the cost of various inputs really was, because there's no market for those inputs, right? And so that problem carries over into military defense. When the government monopolizes the provision of military defense and just says, oh, we're just going to grab, take a bunch of money from the private sector or run the printing press if they're going to pay for it with inflation, and then we're just going to decide we're going to build this many tanks and this many bombers and this many fighters and have this many infantry that we're going to hire, or maybe we'll just conscript them. After the fact, they have no idea, did we spend the right amount on defense, right? If they get conquered, you could say, well, I guess we probably didn't spend enough, or we spent it on the wrong things. But absent that, you don't know year to year, are we doing a good job? You have no feedback, right? And so what would happen, I think, in a market-based voluntary system is that in the event of an invasion, for example, you can really get specific, the insurance companies would set bounties on enemy hardware. Okay, so for example, the insurance companies might tell the private defense companies, hey, there's a foreign government's massing its army on our border, and if they send over their Air Force sends over bombers, for every bomber you knock down, we will pay you whatever, 30 ounces of gold. Okay? And they probably would pay more than that, actually. Whereas for every infantry that's coming in that you neutralize, we'll pay you, an ounce of gold, let's say. Okay? And those numbers wouldn't be arbitrary, because they would be running the numbers, the insurance company, to see, we're on the hook. If one of those bombers takes out one of our skyscrapers, that means such and such. So we'd be willing to pay a lot for you to knock them down. Okay, because that spares us a lot of potential damage claims that we have to pay to our own customers. Okay, so that's where economic rationality would come into this. And then once those bounties were posted, the private companies could then compete with each other and come up with ways to try to provide those services and to get paid for it. And so the beauty of the system is there isn't just one group of people in charge of military defense, just like you don't want to have one group of people in charge of food production. You want to have it dispersed. Let all the entrepreneurs in the community have open entry, and if somebody comes up with a better way to do it, then they win market share. Right? So, some people might specialize in having snipers set up around, and they try to take out enemy infantry, and some people might have surface-to-air missiles. Other people might say, oh, no, why don't we just have our own fighters that go up and take them down that way, that's cheaper, or whatever. All kinds of different things they could do. And that's exactly what you want. You have, the whole community is collectively trying to solve this problem. And the market incentives give the right feedback for how much effort should we devote to this, right? Because it's not that the whole economy needs to turn on a dime and do nothing but provide military defense. You still need to feed people, right? You still need to turn oil into gasoline. You still need to generate electricity, right? So that's the right sort of incentive mechanism by which a free society could rationally respond to the threat of military invasion. Let me just quickly, is the last point I'll make here, address the concern about externalities, right? So in the economics literature, one of the objections to privately provided defense is that there are, specifically, you could say there's positive externalities, and specifically you say it's a public good. And the idea is, if enough people contribute to keep this city safe from an incoming, intercontinental ballistic missile, well, then everybody's safe. And so then there's a problem that people don't want it. They want a free ride. All right. So in general, I think that problem of the public good is exaggerated. So for something like naval convoys, right, like you're sending shipping across the ocean and you want to have naval ships guarding it to, protect it from submarines and stuff like that. Well, that's clearly very well defined, right? You could easily just say, if your convoy doesn't pay us, our Navy's not going to escort you. That's easy, right? And for the people living on the outskirts of your city, you could easily say to them, if you don't pay us, we're going to pull our troops back when there's, foreign invaders on our border and let them take over your house. So clearly all the people on the perimeter are going to have to pay. Otherwise they would be sitting ducks, right? So there's that sort of thing. But then the last point I'll make is you could come up with specific contracts, especially in the modern age with blockchain and smart contracts and things. It would be easy enough to say a sort of thing where, yes, you can contribute to this, but unless we get $1 billion of other donations put in, then, you get your donation back. So you could have thresholds and things set up like that with tipping points where, the contract only goes through if at least 50% of the community has contributed at least $1,000 or whatever the number is going to be. to fund the ballistic missile defense or whatever it is. Okay, so you could come up with things like that where, last thing I'll say is, it clearly would not be a Nash equilibrium to just not have any military defense, right? It's very lumpy, and it's the sort of thing where a little bit of spending can avoid much more in damage. And so even if on the margin you're worried about externalities and things like that, okay, fine, but the point is the free society is still going to come up with ways that they can adequately deploy funds to protect themselves. And I think that their advantages are going to far outweigh any sort of incentive problems that mainstream economists can come up with. Okay, well, thanks, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. And if you want to learn more about this stuff, I would encourage you to read my pamphlet that's called Chaos Theory. If you just Google Robert Murphy Chaos Theory, you'll get the PDF quite easily. I encourage you to continue your study of anarchism and private philanthropic responses to genuine social problems.